A very good evening to all our viewers. Thank you for joining us tonight on the evening review. My name is Toivon Jabela, your host. Tonight we are addressing again the conversation around the Usakos-Karibib road and the companies that have been selected to upgrade that road and the many that have been excluded. And to help us discuss this subject tonight is Bärbel Kirchner. She is the CEO of the Construction Industries Federation of Namibia. Thank you, Bärbel, for making time. You've been here before, but perhaps really your immediate reaction. We saw you in the front pages of all the dailies today, which really speaks to the anger and disappointment from the construction industry.
Yeah, surely. Thank you very much, Toivo. Thank you for inviting me. Yeah, I think it's really of great concern to us, and I mean, concern is probably understated. Yes, we are furious, because in reality, this situation could have been avoided. In December last year, December last year, we had engaged the authorities, the Roads Authority, as well as the KfW. We've had a brief meeting with, but it's particularly the Roads Authority in charge of this project, and we had raised our concerns about the pre-qualification requirements, and obviously, as you can see, it probably has not really brought a lot of results. The situation is, and yes, what you have with your introduction, we have about 7 foreign companies that now have been pre-selected or have been selected after the pre-qualification stage. And that essentially Namibian-owned companies, majority Namibian-owned companies, have not been included. And that is kind of currently partially justified by the Roads Authority by sort of 3 points that they've listed. Number one, they've said not a lot of Namibian companies have participated in the tender. They've mentioned only 17 companies have participated in the pre-qualification, of which there were 3 Namibian companies and 1 Namibian company together in a joint venture with a foreign company. So the argument that they've basically brought across was that not many Namibian companies have participated. The second point that they've made is, well, we are giving 25% of the work to local Namibian-owned contractors. Again, for me, that is not really something that can pacify us. And thirdly, it was also mentioned that the procurement requirements or policy of the financier determined the pre-qualification requirements. And again, I think all of these are really not justifiable. First of all, Namibian contractors didn't participate, didn't even tender because they would not have met the pre-qualification requirements. Which were, first of all, the financial pre-qualification, which included financial requirements in terms of cash flow and previous turnover. And obviously, we know in which kind of environment we found ourselves, or we find ourselves in a recessionary environment, particularly in the construction sector. And also the technical requirements were actually unrealistic and perhaps even irrelevant, because there was a requirement of 60,000 cubic meter of a certain of recycled, what do we call this? But a certain material which should have been used by our contractors in the past, and it's totally irrelevant, and there's no huge technical skill required for that. But essentially, it excluded our contractors because they hadn't done the work previously in that kind of volume. Thirdly, the 25%. Work for Namibian contractors, we can do 100%. We have the capacity, and then with the requirements, because these might have been stipulated by foreign financiers. I think that certainly should not have been an excuse for excluding local contractors. Yeah,
wonderful. This is not the first time that the Federation has actually engaged authorities on these kind of things. There was the African Development Bank loan that Namibia had gotten, and again, if I remember correctly, local construction companies were still left out, and you had personally engaged some of the officials in this regard. What can you tell us about that?
No, I think it's another situation where we basically are being told that nothing can be done, that our hands are tied, that we are essentially the situation is determined by the policy, the procurement policy of the financing organizations. In that case, it was the African Development Bank. And obviously, in the case with the road between Karibib and Usakos, it's the KfW. But should we really put ourselves into a position where we are at mercy to those requirements? Because essentially, yes, we can build an infrastructure, which is very good for us, but are we really also looking at creating employment, alleviating poverty, ensuring sustainable development? I'm not sure. And with the African Development Project in 2018, we had a situation where the upgrade of the railway line between Walvis Bay and Karibib, that was given again to an external or to a foreign company, because again Namibian companies could not pre-qualify because of the financial requirements. And also the same situation with phase 2A of the road between Windhoek and the airport. Again, even though we have the capacity, it was basically awarded to a foreign company.
Yeah.
We've had a chance now recently to meet with representatives of the African Development Bank. We discussed our concern and also raised and hoped to have raised the awareness that indeed we have the capacity. We have companies that have done the work before and do quality work as well. And that should not be a question of not having the capacity, but that the pre-qualification requirements need to be changed. The problem is we're saying, okay, well, these are the requirements of the financier, and therefore we can't do anything. But we need to bear those in mind, the conditions of the financier, but as look at the Namibian reality as well.
Yeah.
So what you can do is, instead of having the 32 kilometers between Usakos and Karibib, you can cut this down into smaller lots, smaller pieces of work and you can get more people involved. You don't have to have foreign companies to do this job. And also you have a situation that people might say, well, you can have a joint venture. But with the current project between Usakos and Karibib, it would not even have been possible for 2 Namibian companies to meet the requirements if they had been in a joint venture, because they were so steep. So essentially, when the Roads Authority referred to a situation that, well, there were 2 Namibian companies who bid and the other one in joint venture with a foreign company, is because they had no other choice. And that really is a situation that we need to avoid in the future. We can't really be make ourselves a victim of the situation. I mean, we need development, but it needs to be sustainable. It can't be a situation that we undermine our own industry, and essentially it will lead to the breakdown of our industry if we don't maintain it and keep it building.
Absolutely. You touched on it a little bit, but at a more technical level, when a foreign financier comes with their conditions like that, in practical terms, what can be done to accommodate Namibian entities? Because obviously, I do not see KWF, for example, just throwing away their legacy policies or financing policies for Namibia. What are the alternatives to make sure that even if they have those rules, somehow, because you mentioned briefly about what could have been done within for the Karibib Usakos road there, what are some of the options that can be weighed?
We understand the conditions, number one, but I think there are different phases of engagement. I think obviously, when the discussions start, I think it's also necessary to involve the construction sector. because I think it's important to have that know-how also available when the negotiations start. Then I also think one need to be very much aware of the conditions. Yes, of course, we need financing and it's very important, but we need to be first of all aware of the conditions. But I think later one can also look at sort of how do we look at those requirements, the conditions, and how do we integrate that with our own reality. We don't have to have these mega-sized projects, and it's not because our companies can't do those projects. They have done those before. It's because the pre-qualification, financial pre-qualification requirements linked to these big science projects basically exclude our contractors, because it's based on previous turnover, and the turnover obviously is aligned to the size of the future project as well, sort of the requirements of turnover, as well as the cash flow. So automatically they are excluded. So if you reduce the size of the project or the entire project into smaller lots, you can have Namibian companies participate, and because they have the capacity.
Yeah. Well, what can you tell us about, because you keep hammering on how this pre-qualification requirements, my director is telling me that it's almost half time, so we'll go for a quick break and then return for second half.
Thank you.
Taking care of children can be one of the busiest jobs in the world. That's why CrècheGuard is here to give you a little help along the way. Start the day with CrècheGuard's immune syrup to help build a strong immune system. CrècheGuard also offers other tasty supplements, such as omega-3 chews to support brain development. And for healthy little tummies, look for CrècheGuard's range of probiotics that come in drops, sprays, and delicious choc bars. Trust in CrècheGuard every day for healthy little bodies and developing minds.
Welcome to My.NA Cars, your ultimate destination for everything automotive.
I am your host, Diana Master. Teamwork makes the dream work, right?
Discover the latest models, innovative technologies, and expert insights from our passionate hosts. Learn essential maintenance tips and get exclusive behind-the-scenes access to the automotive industry. Don't miss My.NA Cars on NTV every Thursday at 2100 hours. Tune in and ignite your passion for automobiles.
Our conversation continues. So Bärbel, I was saying earlier that if you can sort of paint a picture of the situation in the industry right now, because when you talk about this pre-qualification requirements, we seem to be in a position where many Namibian companies cannot meet this, maybe for a variety of reasons. If you can shed light on that.
The pre-qualification requirements of these projects financed by, for instance, the KfW and the World African Development Bank.
Yeah.
I think it's just the size of the projects that determines that.
Yeah.
And that is, number one, the financial requirements linked to the size of the project, which is turnover and cash flow.
Yeah.
Obviously, if the project is bigger, you need to show proof of a higher turnover previously, as well as a higher cash flow.
Yeah.
So if the project size then was smaller, then these requirements would be also accordingly smaller. The same with the technical requirements. I mean, our contractors have built roads before. They have done sort of, big building and civil infrastructure. And the proof is there, so they would be able to meet those requirements. But for example, for this road project between Karibib and Usakos, it was a 60,000 cubic meter stabilized recycled subbase that was required, which has never been used here in Namibia before. And it's not a major technical thing. Our contractors can do more than that, essentially. So the capacity is there. But we need to guard ourselves, because if it continues what is happening now, that we engage foreign contractors practically on almost all road projects at the moment, then we will have a situation that at some point we will no longer have the capacity. And then will make us increasingly dependent on foreign service providers,
Yeah.
And certainly one cannot regard that as sustainable development. And I'm sure that international financiers would want to, see sustainable development in the countries that they are supporting. It's a contradiction, actually.
Yeah. How is the industry at the moment? There's been successive events that really must have impacted on the capacity of the industry. I read not too long ago that I think we had gone so many successive quarters without any growth in the industry. What can you tell us in that regard?
In 2015 the industry was really booming.
Yeah.
We had a contribution of 7.2% to GDP. Now that has changed drastically. We're now, I think, below 2%. Now there was a time, I think, last year when there seemed to have been a sort of improvement of the situation, but currently we find ourselves that things are actually looking worse again.
Yeah.
I mean, anecdotal evidence says that businesses do not have much work in the pipeline, and some of our businesses are busy retrenching again. And that's some of the larger contractors who could have done this job. And reality is that's why we're so furious, because the industry at the moment is really struggling and we don't see a significant improvement. And if all these infrastructure projects that had been that were in the cards for the last few years and that were out on tender, if they had been awarded to Namibian contractors, we would not be in a situation as we are right now. I mean, if you look around, who's doing all the road projects at the moment? It's not Namibian contractors that have the capacity. And the industry is not doing well at the moment. And we need to be very careful, because it can lead to further closures, can lead to further retrenchments, and at the end we sit without a construction sector or local capacity.
Yeah, because when you talk about that contribution to, you said GDP, that's a huge number, 7%. That was a huge number. So what led to the decline? Of course, we had COVID, we had whatever, but do you think that there are also policy issues that have impeded the industry from growing?
No, I think it was obviously 2015, 2016. There was the moratorium on capital projects, and of course the sort of economic situation for Namibia was not particularly great, and it's still currently, it's moving in the positive direction, I hope, generally for our economy. Not necessarily for our industry, as I had mentioned, but I think the overall economy really impacted our industry, of course, as well. And I mean, we can't see construction in isolation of our economy at all. We understand that. But I think that decision at the time to obviously cut spending had a huge impact. And also COVID to some extent, but I certainly would not really blame it on COVID. It was really a boom. 2015, I would say almost too many projects at the time. I think if one had a different approach and would have spread those projects over a period of time, you would have worked for much longer. You might not have been in the situation that we find ourselves in now, and you would have been able to meet at the time the demand internally, because with so much work going on, obviously you then create also scope for more foreign companies to come in, who then stay. So I think it could have been spread out much better, but of course that's hindsight. People are happy when there's boom time, but I think in principle that led to obviously the financial situation that we find ourselves in as a country has a huge impact.
Yeah. What are the competitive disadvantage that local entities have? I'm specifically because I hear people saying, for example, that foreign companies, especially the Chinese companies, they have this strong government backing or backing from their governments and whatnot. In what way do you think that Namibian entities are disadvantaged?
I think that's exactly what you said. I think that's a very strong point. You would find that the foreign companies would often be supported by their so-called sending governments. They would be supported by their state finance, and you would find simply that they get cheaper financing arrangements than Namibian companies would have, and often they would also have the benefits of economies of scale, as they might also be operating in other countries as well. And it is possible also that they might not entirely adhere to all local legislation and regulation, and therefore that might not be reflected necessarily in their sort of costing for when submitting, the tenders. I think obviously we want to see that all companies in the sector adhere to all relevant legislation, including the minimum wages, and for example, our collective agreement, which stipulates certain requirements that these are adhered to. So this has a cost implication. But I think there's also slowly but surely a perception being created, and I don't really know where this comes from. Well, I actually do know, but that some people say, well, Namibian companies, they run away from the projects. They do not complete the projects. The quality is poor. And I think one really has to be very careful making that statement. Obviously, I've read some comments on Facebook, and there's quite a few people who say, well, Namibian companies run away from projects, or owners of companies, and buy big fancy cars and so on. The reality is that is happening as well, but these are not necessarily the companies that we are talking about that should be getting these tenders. We have been engaging government for many, many years, and then we've asked for the establishment of a construction council, which would regulate the industry, which would monitor the industry, and which basically, because every company or every business that's practicing or is active in the construction sector would have to register with the council. And that way you are able to establish what is their capacity and align the size of project with the size of business. Because then you would basically you won't have smaller companies doing bigger projects not being able to handle them, or you would definitely have a way to regulate, police, and there would be consequences if work would not be completed. Now, our own contractors from the Construction Industries Federation, we are a member-based organization, so we can't really police, but we can monitor. Our contractors have to adhere to our code of conduct, and sort of in the absence of a construction council, I would always recommend to engage a member of the Construction Industries Federation, because they have to adhere to a code of conduct. Projects that had been handled by government, many of them are uncompleted, and the workmanship was poor. And this is really very sad situation, because they should be adequately policed and monitored. And one should know in advance of the capacity. And then we have also a situation where we are being told, well, a lot of work is going to Namibian contractors. What are we on about when we're saying that it goes to foreign companies? The reality is that these are projects that are awarded to local so-called tenderpreneurs, and they subcontract to foreign companies. I mean, that certainly cannot be in our interest, because then the only sort of capacity they have is good negotiation skills and, a briefcase. Sorry to be a little that is simply not, and maybe contacts. I think that is not what we want for our industry. We want to have maintain our capacity and further build that. ultimately for our own economic independence.
Absolutely. Bärbel, thank you for making time.
I thank you very much,
Yeah,
Toivo.
wonderful.
Yeah.
That was tonight's show with Bärbel Kirchner. She's just really filling us in on the construction industry's feeling towards the fact that the Usakos and Karibib road upgrade has been, all Namibian companies have been kept out of that tender, and of course also filling us in on the latest regarding the industry. Thank you for watching.